on to a question from Mario, who writes, I remember during the Bush years, post-2001, there was a press conference where either Bush himself or his administration made an announcement that they would start using false information in the media to flush out national security leaks. Is this a distorted memory? I've been for the past 2 weeks trying to dig up any info, but I'm quite the investigative neophyte. I'm sure this seems insignificant, but for me to come out in public and announce that you will be lying to the country seems to be a notable point. If you know anything of this, could you point me in the correct direction? Thank you for the question, Mario. Off the top of my head, I don't know of specifically the scenario you're talking about there, where there was some sort of press conference where they announced, we're going to lie to try to flush out national security leaks. I haven't heard that per se. Maybe it exists, and again, I hope if it does, someone can point us in that direction. But it does seem to correspond to some stories that I can think of. For example, the question of the video news reports and other types of propaganda, domestic propaganda that is technically illegal, that has been used going back to at least the Clinton administration, and of course during the Bush administration, that was technically ruled illegal by the Government Accountability Office, but which the Bush administration specifically said, oh, well, we're not going to follow it. And I did cover this along with a lot of other pieces of this PSYOPs puzzle in a Boiling Frogs Post report that I did back a few years ago called PSYOPs 101, PSYOPs on the Home Front. Both the Bush administration and the Clinton administration before it made extensive use of video news reports, or VNRs, to influence public opinion on key issues. The reports, made to look like genuine news reports and then shopped around to news networks to be aired on the nightly news without any mention of their source, have been extensively used to tout government programs. The Clinton administration, for example, used VNRs to promote Clinton's Medicare proposals, and the Bush administration used it even more extensively to promote newly formed government agencies like the TSA and dubious government programs like No Child Left Behind. The government's own Government Accountability Office repeatedly ruled that the administration's use of these VNRs was in fact illegal domestic propaganda, but the Bush White House dismissed this finding, arguing that the use of such reports was an issue of government intent, not legal restriction. This argument was also used by the Department of Defense, which in 2003 issued an Information Operations Roadmap detailing the Rumsfeld DoD's PSYOP strategies. The document failed to cite any of the statutory provisions putting legal restraints on the department's ability to disseminate propaganda domestically, admitting that information intended for foreign audiences, including public diplomacy and PSYOP, increasingly is consumed by our domestic audience and vice versa, but arguing that the distinction between foreign and domestic audiences becomes more a question of U.S. government intent rather than information dissemination practices. The document goes on to argue that the Internet is akin to an enemy weapons system and asserts that the DoD's defense in-depth strategy should operate on the premise that the department will fight the net as it would a weapons system. In 2000, it was discovered that CNN had employed active-duty U.S. PSYOPs officers at its headquarters in Atlanta. It has since emerged that this was part of a larger program including other news networks that embedded PSYOPs officers in various newsrooms across the country.
The U.S. Army has used local television stations in the U.S. as training posts for some of its psychological operations personnel, according to Yahoo News blog The Upshot. Since at least 2001, both WRAL, a CBS affiliate in Raleigh, North Carolina, and WTOC, a CBS affiliate in Savannah, Georgia, have regularly hosted active-duty soldiers from the Army's 4th Psychological Operations Group as part of the Army's Training with Industry program. Training with Industry is designed to offer career soldiers a chance to pick up skills through internships and fellowships with private businesses. The PSYOP soldiers used WRAL and WTOC to learn broadcasting and communications expertise that they could apply in their mission, as the Army describes it, of, quote, influencing the emotions, motives, objective reasoning, and ultimately the behavior of foreign audiences. WRAL and WTOC were on a list of participants in the Army's Training with Industry program provided to the Upshot in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. And a spokeswoman with the Army's Human Resources Command confirmed that PSYOP soldiers worked at the stations. Lieutenant Colonel Stacy Bathrick said, quote, "Both of these stations are very supportive of the military and think very highly of the program." Bathrick said the soldiers were never involved in news gathering.
I hope you'll go and watch that full report in its entirety, or rewatch it if you watched it in the past, because I myself haven't watched it or thought about it for years now, and there were parts in there that I'd forgotten, like the craziness of the Pentagon PSYOPs brainwashing campaign against 5 senators to get them to vote for further funding of the Afghanistan war. Just craziness like that. So yes, there is domestic propaganda that goes on and lying to the American public in one form or another. It was specifically ruled illegal by the Government Accountability Office and specifically rejected by the Bush administration back in the middle part of last decade. So I think that's along the lines of what you're talking about there, Mario, if not exactly the way you remember it. I'll also throw in an update from a couple of years ago. People might remember the Smith-Mundt Act that is part of the legislation specifically prohibiting domestic propaganda was repealed or reformed a couple of years ago to specifically allow government-made news to be broadcast and disseminated domestically. So the VOA and Radio Free Europe and all those other propaganda government mouthpieces are now specifically allowed, not illegal. So that's just a little update.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. Now, we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the National News Services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
President, earlier this year you told us you had ordered your administration to cease and desist on payments to journalists to promote your agenda. You cited the need for ethical concerns and the need for a bright line between the press and the government. Your administration continues to make the use of video news releases, which are prepackaged news stories sent to television stations, fully aware that some or many of these stations will air them without any disclaimer that they are produced by the government. Comptroller General of the United States this week said that raises ethical questions. Does it raise ethical questions about the use of government money to produce stories about the government that wind up being aired with no disclosure that they were produced by the government?
There is a Justice Department opinion that says these pieces are within the law so long as they're based upon facts, not advocacy. And I expect our agencies to adhere to that ruling, to that Justice Department opinion. This has been a long-standing practice of the federal government to use these types of videos. The Agricultural Department, as I understand, has been using these videos for a long period of time. The Defense Department, other departments have been doing so. It's important that they be based upon the guidelines set out by the Justice Department. Now, I think it'd be helpful if local stations then disclose to their viewers if that's, that this was based upon a factual report and they chose to use it. But evidently in some cases that's not the case. So anyway.
The administration is to guarantee that's happening by including that language in the prepackaged report.
Yeah, I don't, oh, you mean a disclosure on George W. Bush and I?
Well, some way to make sure it couldn't air without the disclosure that you believe is so vital.
Ken, I mean, there's a procedure that we're going to follow, and the local stations ought to, if there's a deep concern about that, ought to tell their viewers what they're watching.